In the fog-choked hills of northern Scotland, there's a crypt abandoned since 1845, its stone door mysteriously opening on its own 3 times in over 150 years. In 1920, a group of local priests went missing while investigating the crypt's eerie occurrences. Their journal, found years later, detailed disturbing symbols etched into the walls, children's names, crossed out with blood. The church sealed all records, deeming them unsuitable for the public. But I've uncovered the forbidden footage. What you're about to see was meant to stay hidden. Type "I'm ready" if you dare to uncover the truth they silenced. There is an old saying in the village of Glenmore, whispered on nights when the fog clings to the hills like a ghost's breath. The crypt does not forget, but it takes what it is owed. Those who speak it know the weight of history in their bones, the kind that lingers in darkened corners of memory, always just beyond reach. In the heart of Glenmore, nestled within the mist-choked hills, stood an ancient crypt. It had not been opened 4 years, decades even, but still, the townsfolk feared it, as one fears a distant echo in an empty hall. 3 times since 1845, the stone door of the crypt had creaked open, and each time, there had been whispers of bodies gone missing, of the priests who had gone inside, and never returned. Father Callahan, the parish priest who had only recently arrived in 1920, was not one to believe in superstition, but he found himself drawn to the crypt, his curiosity gnawing at his resolve. There were records, after all, from the diocesan archives, a ledger of sorts, detailing the previous attempts to uncover the mystery hidden within the crypt's cold stone walls. But these records were not written by the hands of men who had answers. No, they were written by the hands of those who had lost their way. Callahan's office was small, dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of ink and dust. A single candle flickered on the desk, its light casting shadows that seemed to reach for him. Beneath a pile of old prayer books and neglected hymnal sheets, he found the ledger, bound in what seemed to be old leather, its edges cracked with age. The pages, yellowed and brittle, were filled with the names of priests who had entered the crypt before him, names that by the next entry had disappeared entirely. Some of the pages were stained, the ink soaked and blurred. Yet there was one line that Callahan could still read with clarity. The silence has claimed them. He turned the page slowly, as if fearing the ink would smudge further with each touch. There, at the back of the ledger, was a hymn, or what had once been a hymn. The notes had bled into each other, a strange cadence, erratic and unsettling. He felt the hairs on his neck prickle as his eyes moved over the broken melody, the rhythmic hum that almost seemed to echo in the room. The hymn was soaked in what? He could not tell, but it was unmistakable. The red stains that marred the pages, soaking through the notes. He recoiled, as though it were the touch of a long-dead hand. His thoughts churned, struggling to make sense of it all, when suddenly, the soft thrum of the bell tower's toll echoed in the distance, reminding him of the hour when everything was due. The crypt was calling him. He had to go. Father Callahan wrapped himself in his cloak and made his way toward the crypt. As he walked through the village, the fog seemed thicker, more oppressive than he remembered. It clung to the air like a shroud, and the streets, once familiar, now felt alien, as though they too were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The crypt stood at the edge of the churchyard, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. It was ancient, older than the stone walls of the church itself, and its door was a single massive slab of weather-worn granite. The iron latch was rusted, its shape warped by time, but it was not locked. It had never been locked. Callahan reached for the latch, his fingers brushing the cold metal. The sound of the bell tower, still tolling in the distance, seemed to grow louder, each toll a drumbeat that resonated in his chest. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the stone door, as though waiting for it to reveal its secrets. And then, with a swift motion, he pulled the latch open. The door groaned in protest, but it moved. As it swung inward, a rush of cold air billowed out, carrying with it the scent of damp stone, earth, and something faintly metallic. It was as though the crypt had been waiting, patient and still, for someone to disturb its peace. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the ground beneath his feet was uneven. The stone walls were covered in dark moss, and faint carvings, half-erased by centuries of neglect, lined the edges of the crypt. He stepped forward, the sound of his boots scraping against the cold, uneven floor breaking the silence. His breath was shallow, every exhale seeming louder than it should have been. There was something about this place, something in the air, that pressed against him, constricting his chest. The deeper he went, the heavier the air became. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching longer with every step. At the far end of the crypt, beneath an altar that had long since decayed, was a stone sarcophagus. It was cracked, the edges worn away by time, but it was unmistakable. This was the heart of the mystery. Callahan approached it slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for the stone lid. He paused, his fingers inches from the cold surface. He could hear something faint, a distant whisper, a murmur of voices, almost too soft to discern. And then, as his fingers made contact with the lid, a single, sharp sound echoed through the crypt, the unmistakable noise of a bell tolling, loud and insistent, as though it were calling him, urging him to open the sarcophagus. The sound was so close now, so much louder, that he nearly turned to look behind him. But something stopped him, a gnawing sense that something had already crossed the threshold, something that had been waiting for him. With a final reluctant motion, Father Callahan pushed the lid open. The air inside was rank, heavy with the scent of decay. His stomach turned, and his heart pounded as he peered inside. There, at the center of the stone tomb, lay a figure, a body wrapped in tattered cloth, its face obscured by shadows. Callahan leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. There, beneath the cloth, was a glint of something bright, something red. The faintest trace of blood soaked into the fabric. The silence that followed was oppressive, suffocating. It was the silence of centuries, the silence of a truth that had been buried, forgotten, and never meant to be found. And then, in the stillness of the crypt, he heard it, the faintest whisper, like a breath in his ear. "The silence has claimed you, Father." Callahan froze, his heart stopping in his chest. The voice was not his own. The bell tolled again, louder now, and the stone door behind him began to close. As it did, he caught sight of something in the darkness, something that should not have been there, something watching him from the shadows, waiting. The door slammed shut with a deafening finality, and the crypt was silent once more. But the ledger remained, its pages soaked in blood. The ink not yet entirely faded. The church stood crooked beneath the weight of 1,000 forgotten prayers. In the year of our Lord, 1920, its pews had long been emptied, its floors no longer polished by the steps of the faithful. The altar, once alight with the glow of candles, now gathered dust, its silence thick with the scent of mildew and neglect. But in its shadows, something older than time seemed to stir, something buried beneath the chapel floorboards, something that had never truly gone away. Father Aldrich had always been a man of unwavering faith, a man who believed the church's history was sacred, each stone of its walls a testament to the righteousness of the divine. Yet, the moment he stepped into the chapel that evening, something heavy settled on his heart, a sense that something had shifted, that something had been allowed to fester in the dark corners of the church. His breath was shallow as he moved through the empty sanctuary, the light from the flickering candles casting long twisted shadows on the walls. He paused at the altar, his fingers brushing against the edge of the stone. There, beneath the gold cloth draped over it, he could make out the faintest outline of something, a symbol, carved deep into the surface. A symbol he had not noticed before. It was not just any mark, he realized, but something ancient, something unspeakable. His hands trembled as he traced the edges, the cool stone beneath his fingers seeming to pulse with an eerie, unseen life. Behind him, the door to the sacristy creaked open, but Aldrich did not turn. He knew who it was. Father Lucien, the eldest among them, had been the one to suggest this investigation. It had been his idea to search beneath the chapel. They had heard rumors of rituals and chants, whispered from trembling lips, but Aldrich had not believed them at first. Lucien, the older priest, had spoken little since their descent into the crypt the night before, his eyes wide with terror, his lips sealed in a way Aldrich could not ignore. There had been something in Lucien's voice earlier, before the storm rolled in, something in the way he had muttered the words, "We have opened the wrong door." Aldrich could still hear that whisper ringing in his ears, louder than the wind outside. Now, Lucien stood behind him, silent, watching. "We should not have come," Aldrich whispered, as if speaking aloud might make it true. He turned to face his fellow priest, only to find Lucien's expression hollow, drained. The skin of his face was taut, his eyes darkened with something Aldrich could not name. "I have seen what lies beneath this church." "Aldrich," Lucien said, his voice low, almost drowned in his own disbelief. and I fear it is not what we were meant to find." Aldrich's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to ask him more, to demand the truth, to unravel the mystery, but the words died in his throat. He knew something terrible had happened when they descended into the crypt, something so wretched that even the earth itself seemed to recoil in fear. "I've felt its presence," Lucian continued. "It moves beneath the stones, beneath the chapel floor. The crypt ... was never meant to be disturbed." Aldrich shook his head, as though shaking off the weight of the words. He had to remain resolute. They were priests, men of God. There could be no evil beneath this sacred ground. But Lucian's face twisted in anguish. "The hymn," he whispered. "The chant. It's still ringing. I can hear it in my bones. It won't let us leave." Aldrich's eyes widened, and he stumbled backward, his heart lurching. He thought of the hymn he had seen in the ledger, the one that had been soaked in blood. Had Lucian heard it too? Was it the same cursed song, the one that had driven those before them to madness? His breath caught in his throat, but before he could speak, Lucian's voice shattered the silence. "The last mass was not for the living, Aldrich. It was a sacrifice, and we are the ones to be offered." Aldrich's hands shook violently now, his body taut with fear. He turned toward the altar, his mind racing. Something was wrong, something beyond the crypt, beyond the blood-stained hymn. The air around him grew thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him. The ground beneath him shifted, and with a violent force, a hidden door in the altar floor opened, revealing a set of narrow, winding stairs that led downward into the pitch black of the earth. The air that rose from below was cold, unnaturally cold, as though it had not seen the light of day for centuries. Lucian stepped forward, his body swaying as though caught between two worlds. "The ritual is not complete," he murmured, his eyes glazed over, as if in a trance. "It was never meant for us to finish. We must leave ... or become part of it." Aldrich could not breathe. He tried to speak, to call out to his fellow priest, but the words caught in his throat. His gaze shifted to the open door below, the darkness pulling at him with an insidious force. The chanting, faint but growing louder, reverberated through the very walls. It was an unholy song, a dirge for the damned. The notes stretched in unnatural ways, twisting and turning like a rope strangling his thoughts. He heard Lucian's voice again, this time barely a whisper. "We should have never come." With shaking hands, Aldrich reached for the door, his mind racing as he stepped closer to the void that awaited beneath. The air felt alive, charged with something ancient, something alive. His heart thrummed in his chest, and in the distance, the faintest sound of a bell tolled. Not the church bell, the bell from the crypt. It tolled as if calling them back to that place they had disturbed. Suddenly, there was a sound, footsteps, slow, deliberate, growing louder from within the darkness below. Aldrich froze. Someone, or something, was coming. His blood ran cold. The last thing he saw before the door slammed shut was Lucian's face, staring back at him, a look of horror etched on his features. The priest mouthed one final word, "Run," but it was too late. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the bell, still tolling beneath the chapel, and far below, something stirred, waiting to finish what had been started. The wind that swept through Glenmore carried with it the scent of ancient soil, wet and heavy from days of unrelenting rain. The air hung thick with a sort of waiting, as though the village itself breathed in the silence and exhaled only in whispers. It was in this silence that the historian, Simon Cairns, found himself drawn to the story of a boy whose name had been swallowed by time, though his fate lingered in the shadows. The boy's testimony had been buried, ignored, perhaps, or worse, dismissed as the wild imaginings of a child. But Cairns, a man with a family deeply tied to the history of the village, could not let the boy's words fade into nothingness. There was too much at stake, too much hidden beneath the layers of soot and grief that had accumulated over the years. He sat at his desk, the faded ledger before him, the ink smeared by time, but still legible, still telling its quiet story. His hand trembled as he traced the boy's words. "I saw it in the crypt, a figure, its face twisted with pain. It looked at me, and I heard the sound of chains. The walls were closing in. I heard it whisper my name. It was not the same as before. It was something different." The boy had been found dead near the crypt, his body broken, twisted as though he had fallen from a great height. His hands, however, told a different story. They were covered in mud, as though something had reached up from beneath the earth to drag him down. They said it was an accident, that he had tripped and fallen. But Cairns had never believed it. He had known, instinctively, that the truth was buried beneath layers of soil and silence. The crypt had always been a place of mystery and gloom. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, as though the very ground it stood on was cursed. It was said to be the resting place of those long forgotten, of the priests whose names had never been spoken aloud after their ill-fated attempts to uncover what lay beneath the stone. But to Cairns, there was something deeper at place, something more insidious, rooted in the very fabric of his own family's past. His great-grandfather had been one of the original founders of the church in Glenmore, and his family's silence had shaped the town's history. They had always been the keepers of secrets, the silent witnesses to events that had never been meant to be remembered. Cairns had spent years trying to piece together the fragments, trying to understand the true history of the crypt, but every path he had followed had led only to more questions, more unspoken truths. The boy's story was the most telling of all. Cairns had known him by name Thomas Ain, a boy whose family had once lived in a crumbling cottage near the crypt, a boy whose death had been overshadowed by the mysterious disappearances of the priests. The boy had been the first to see the figure, had seen something in the crypt that no one else dared to acknowledge. Cairns ran a hand through his thinning hair, his thoughts tangled in the same web that had ensnared generations of his ancestors. The words in the ledger were not just the ramblings of a frightened child. They were the key to something much darker, something buried deep beneath the chapel floor, something that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. The wind outside howled. The sound, like a distant wail, carried on the air. Cairns lifted his gaze to the window, but the fog that rolled in from the hills had obscured everything beyond it. The village seemed to vanish in the distance, swallowed by the mists that clung to the earth as if trying to keep it from being seen. He stood from his desk, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight, and moved to the small cabinet where he kept the old family records. There, hidden among the papers, was the letter. It had been sealed with wax, the mark of the Cairns family crest, still intact. It was a letter his great-grandfather had written years before his death, a letter that spoke of a pact to silence that had been forged between the family and the forces that inhabited the crypt. Simon had read it once, long ago, but the words had haunted him ever since. The letter spoke of the figure, the one the boy had seen, and the pact that had been made to keep it locked away. The crypt was not a resting place, as the town believed, but a prison, and the boy had seen something he was never meant to see. With trembling hands, Simon opened the letter once more, the wax breaking in a crisp snap. His heart pounded as he read the words again. The crypt must remain closed. We must not seek what lies beneath. There are forces there that are not of this world. We have sealed them away, but the key to unlocking them is still within our reach. The boy will see the truth, but he must not speak of it. If he does, it will undo everything we have worked to contain. The words seemed to twist and writhe in the dim light of the study, the faint scent of old paper filling the room. Cairns felt the weight of his ancestors' silence pressing down on him, urging him to turn away, to leave the past undisturbed. But he knew better now. The boy had seen something, and it was the only thing that could explain the strange darkness that had settled over the village. The very air felt thicker now, heavier, as if the crypt had somehow found its way into the world beyond its walls. Outside, the fog was thickening, obscuring everything in its path, and Cairns felt a deep unease wash over him. It was as though the crypt had reached out, calling him, drawing him closer to the place he had sworn to never return. He grabbed his coat and left the study, his footsteps quick and sharp against the cold stone floor of the house. The wind howled louder as he opened the door, the fog spilling in like a living thing. He had to see it again. He had to know what the boy had seen. The crypt was waiting. The wind howled again, a banshee's wail, and Cairns walked into the fog, toward the place where his family's silence had begun. Behind him, in the shadows of the study, a single candle flickered and went out. The chapel was cold, far colder than it had any right to be, and the shadows seemed to hold more weight in its corners than they ought. Father Bernard sat alone at the altar, his once black robes now faded and worn, the edges tattered with age. The candlelight flickered weakly before him, casting trembling light on his pale, thin face. His hands were clasped together, trembling slightly as they rested on the worn wood of the pew in front of him. The air smelled of dust and incense, old and stale, as though the very stones themselves had grown tired of bearing witness. He had not prayed in years, But tonight, the weight of years of silence finally pressed upon him. He had not been called to the altar for solace, but for confession, his own confession, one that had festered in the dark corners of his mind since that fateful day. He had never been one to speak of the crypt, though he had known its secrets. Long before the whispers started to haunt the town, there had been a time when he had believed that God's will was greater than any earthly fear, that faith could overcome any shadow, any darkness. But that was before he had learned the truth that the church, the very institution to which he had devoted his life, had played a part in the horrors hidden beneath the chapel, the truth that he himself had been complicit in silencing the screams of those who had sought to uncover the crypt's dark power, the truth that, for all his piety, he had turned a blind eye to the very evil he had sworn to protect against. His breath came in shallow gasps, each exhale sounding like a prayer he had never spoken aloud. There was something pressing against his chest, a weight that threatened to crush him, but he could not undo what had already been done. He could not return to the past, to the moment when he had sealed his silence. But this confession would have to be enough. It was the only thing he had left. Father Bernard shifted in his seat, his eyes falling upon the old, cracked crucifix that hung above the altar. The Christ depicted there seemed to watch him with a sorrowful gaze, its face twisted in agony, the blood of martyrdom still fresh in the figure's hollow eyes. The image was haunting, but not nearly as haunting as the memory that clung to him, lingering like a stain that could not be washed away. It had been years ago, decades, when the crypt had first begun to reveal its true nature. He had been a young priest then, just starting his service at the church, naive and full of zeal. He had heard the rumors, the whispers of ancient rites performed in secret, of the crypt's cursed origin, of figures seen moving in the darkness beneath the chapel, but he had dismissed them, as any devout priest would. The town's superstitions were nothing more than the ravings of the fearful and the ignorant. The church had a higher purpose, after all. But then there had been the priests, the ones who had gone down into the crypt seeking answers. They had gone down with hope in their hearts, only to return broken, their minds shattered, their bodies left in pieces. The first had been Father Gabriel, who had spoken little in the days leading up to his descent. He had simply stared at the crypt with eyes wide with terror, murmuring under his breath, as if listening to something only he could hear. Father Bernard had not been the one to accompany him that night. He had stayed behind, too afraid of what lay beneath, too uncertain of what they might find. But when Gabriel returned, it was clear that something had broken within him. He was not the man he had been before. The terror in his eyes was too deep, too ancient to be understood by any mortal. And it was that terror, that silent scream, that had warned Father Bernard of the truth. The church had known, they had always known. Father Bernard had learned this in the dead of night, alone in his study, when a letter from the bishop arrived, sealed with the church's official wax. Inside, the words were clear, cold, and unforgiving. The crypt was not to be disturbed. It was not just a place of burial, it was a place of power, and the church had nurtured it, sheltered it, for centuries. The crypt had not been built by the faithful, but by those who had sought to wield its dark force for their own gain. The letter spoke of rituals, old rites, that had been passed down through generations of priests, rites that had been used to bind something beneath the cupola force that could neither be named nor contained. It spoke of the blood that had been spilled, of the sacrifices made to keep the power sealed, and of the church's deliberate role in perpetuating the silence that had been woven into the very foundation of the chapel, the silence that had kept the evil contained. Father Bernard had read the letter in silence, the weight of his ancestors' sins pressing down on him like a suffocating shroud. He had known then that he could never speak of it. The church had made its pact, and he, as a servant of God, had no choice but to honor it. But honor, in this case, had been a lie that had poisoned his soul, a lie that had cost lives. And then came the boy Thomas Ainsley, the one who had seen the figure in the crypt, the one who had come too close to the truth. His death, like so many before him, had been written off as an accident. But Father Bernard knew better. The boy's hands had been covered in mud that had not come from the earth above. Something had reached up from beneath, and the boy had paid the price for his curiosity. The guilt gnawed at Father Bernard, a relentless ache that never faded. He had known all along, known the truth of what lay beneath, and had kept it hidden. The church had concealed it, nurtured it, and now it was too late to undo the damage. Father Bernard's gaze turned once more to the crucifix, its empty eyes staring back at him, accusing him of the very sins he had sought to bury. He whispered his final words into the darkness of the chapel, his voice barely more than a breath. "The silence was never meant to protect us," he said. "It was meant to protect it." The candle flickered once, then went out, leaving the chapel in total darkness. The ground was soft, too soft. The earth had never forgotten what had been buried there, and it seemed to exhale a faint, suffocating breath each time a shovel pierced its surface. Edmund Wallace, the village's only remaining historian, stood over the site with a muted sense of dread. The cemetery had long been abandoned, the headstones now crooked and almost swallowed by creeping ivy. But the graves near the crypt were different. They had not been marked. The dirt was disturbed, as though something or someone had been hastily buried beneath the shadows of the chapel's looming presence, and buried deep, like the town's forgotten sins, were the bones of children. He had stumbled upon it by chance, or, perhaps, the land had simply whispered its secrets to him at last. It had been years since the crypt's dark history began to unravel, and yet, the deeper he dug, the less he understood. The children, their small bones cracked and scattered, had once been the villagers' forgotten innocence, their lives nothing more than whispers carried away on the wind. Their bodies had been hidden, sealed beneath layers of time and silence. But now, as Edmund crouched over the unmarked graves, a different truth was being uncovered. He reached down carefully, his gloved fingers brushing the exposed edge of a small skull. It was no larger than a doll's, its empty eye socket staring back up at him with an accusation he couldn't ignore. A tremor ran through his hands as he carefully moved the dirt aside. The bones were small, delicate, fragile, and the faces of some of the children had been etched with symbols, carved so faintly into their skulls that they seemed almost like a dream, a nightmare barely remembered. Symbols of protection perhaps, or of something darker. Symbols of binding. His heart thudded heavily against his ribs. The feeling of intrusion, of desecration, grew stronger with every passing moment. He could almost hear their faint cries, their pleas for mercy, echoing in the silence of the grave. Edmund had always believed history had a way of forgetting the worst parts. But some things, some secrets would not be forgotten, and as his fingers lingered on the fragile skull, he wondered if he, too, would become part of the crypt's forgotten truths. The soil parted like the opening of a long-closed door, revealing more than bones. There, half buried among the rubble of graves, lay something that shouldn't have been there, a doll. It was not a child's toy, but something twisted, wrong. Its porcelain face was cracked, its painted eyes wide and glassy, as though it had seen something terrible. A twisted string of hair hung from its head, damp from the earth's chill, and in its tiny, broken hands was something more chilling still, an unmarked key. Edmund's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the object, knowing instinctively that it was tied to the crypt. A doll, broken and discarded, but its presence seemed deliberate, as if it had been placed there, buried with the children, as a keepsake, a token to seal their fate. The symbol was now clear to him, more clear than any piece of history had ever been. A ritual had been performed on these children, and the innocents, who had never been meant to be part of this. He could not be certain of the details, but he could feel the weight of it in his bones. Something had been done to them, and the doll was no mere accident. It had been left as a mark of ownership, a sign that they had been claimed, their lives sacrificed for a purpose no child should ever serve. The doll's presence was the final proof the ritual had taken place, and the church had been involved. Edmund stepped back, his heart thudding in his chest. The air around him grew colder, the wind cutting through the trees like a jagged whisper. His hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his brow, though the temperature had dropped sharply. He was no longer sure if the chill in the air was the wind, or the weight of the truth finally settling in. The crypt had always been a place of power, a place of secrets, buried beneath layers of history. But the church's role in this dark ritual, it was not something that had been an accident or an oversight. It was deliberate, planned. The children had been sacrificed to something older than the church, something the church had desperately tried to keep locked away. And for generations, it had remained hidden, covered by time, by silence, by the church's own hand. As Edmund's mind raced, the ground seemed to shift again. He had no doubt now this was not the end of the story. No, it was only the beginning. The key in the doll's hands had to lead somewhere. It had to, but as he stepped back, An unsettling feeling washed over him, one he couldn't explain. It was as if the earth itself was watching, listening, waiting for him to turn away. He glanced down at the exposed skulls again, their eyes void of life, but filled with something far worse: betrayal. Each symbol carved into their bone was a reminder that some things, some truths could not remain buried forever. The wind howled louder, pulling him back toward the crypt. Edmund's breath caught in his throat as he felt the unmistakable presence of something behind him. It was as though the very earth beneath him stirred, awakening from a long slumber. The doll's empty eyes stared at him, its cracked porcelain face fixed in an eternal expression of terror. As he turned toward the crypt, the silence seemed to hold its breath. A faint ringing, like the sound of a distant bell, echoed in the air, followed by a whisper so faint it might have been a dream. Leave, or join them. Edmund froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned to look over his shoulder, but the grave was empty now save for the broken doll, which seemed to lean slightly forward, its unblinking eyes still trained on him. The candlelight flickered and danced in the stillness of the study. It was as though the very air was holding its breath, waiting for the secrets to be uncovered. Edmund Wallace, bent over the desk, traced the weathered edges of an old hymn book. It had surfaced from the depths of the church's forgotten archives, its pages soaked, as though dipped in milk and ink, the two liquids blurring together into something unnatural. The book felt heavier than its weight, as though it carried a burden that was too much for any human hands to bear. It was not the first time Edmund had encountered such relics in his research. The crypt's presence had cast a long, unyielding shadow over the village, a shadow that had claimed the memory of its inhabitants long before the crypt had fallen into ruin. But this hymn was different. The cover was cracked, its leather binding dry and brittle to the touch. But what made Edmund's breath hitch was the unmistakable texture of the material that bound it. The book was not merely sewn with thread, but stitched with skin, pale, cold skin, barely perceptible beneath the weight of time. Edmund's stomach lurched, a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck as he carefully opened the book to its first page. The ink was faded, but still legible, a language long forgotten, its words twisted and strange. The letters seemed to crawl across the page, the rhythm of the text unsettling in its flow. The hymn was not for the living, it was a song for the priests, a chant meant to bind them to something darker, something buried beneath the crypt's cold stones. Edmund's fingers lingered on the page, tracing the delicate script, his mind struggling to make sense of the impossible. He had spent years in the archives, delving into the village's dark past, but never had he found something so directly tied to the rituals of the church. The crypt was a tomb for many, but it had once been a place of power, a place where sacrifices were made, and the church had known. The hymn was meant to be sung, and the promise within its lyrics, its words of broken oaths and promises never kept, was a pact that had bound the town to something far older than any faith. Edmund could feel the weight of the ancient agreement in his bones, the music that had never truly left the crypt, humming softly beneath the surface of the earth. He turned the page, his eyes widening as the next set of lyrics appeared before him. The ink had bled into the paper, soaking through in patches as though the song had been written in blood. The language was unfamiliar, but the rhythm of the hymn seemed to beat with a pulse that matched his own. His heart quickened, and for a moment, Edmund wondered if the hymn might somehow reach into his soul, unraveling the very fabric of his thoughts. The next line of text seemed to echo through the room, a whisper he could almost hear beneath the page. "You will bind the souls of the innocent, and they will keep us from the dark." A chill crawled down his spine. The words were clear, unmistakable. He had heard the rumors of children, the ones who had gone missing, the ones whose bodies had never been found. He had heard the whispers of the lost innocents, their souls, sacrificed to appease something darker, something the church had hoped to control. The hymn, it seemed, was not just a song, it was a summoning, a plea for power, a contract with the unseen forces that lay beneath the crypt. Edmund's pulse raced, his thoughts a blur. How could the church have hidden this? How could they have allowed such a thing to go unspoken for so long? His fingers trembled as they turned to the next page. The sound of the pages shifting through the air was like the slow creaking of an old door being pushed open, the smell of ancient dust filling his senses. As he read on, the words became more erratic, the melody more frantic. The lyrics described not only rituals but a presence that seemed to writhe beneath the surface of the earth, a presence that the priests had tried to bind, to control, but that was never meant to be held. It was then that Edmund's eyes caught something strange, something that shouldn't have been there. Beneath the hymn, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand, was a final note. It must never be sung aloud. The price is too great. The room seemed to darken, the shadows thickening around him. Edmund could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him, as though the very walls of the study were closing in. The smell of damp earth, the same smell that had followed him through the crypt, filled his nostrils. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, the edges of his vision blurred. And then, there it was, the book began to shake, the pages fluttering as though caught in an unseen wind. Edmund's breath hitched, his body frozen in place, as the pages turned on their own, faster and faster, until they stopped at a final verse. The words, written in the same ancient script, were unrecognizable. The melody was gone, replaced by something darker, more primal. The souls of the bound will call upon the priesthood, and the priesthood will answer. They will be the chains that hold the dark at bay. But when the chain breaks, they will come. Edmund's throat tightened, the words reverberating in his mind. The dark, the one that had always waited beneath the crypt, was calling, and the book, the hymn, was the key. The church had known. They had always known. And now, the chain was fraying. The shadows seemed to deepen around him, the faint sound of bells tolling from somewhere far in the distance, soft and mournful. The hymn, forgotten for so long, was being sung in his ears, its melody haunting, its rhythm steady, like the slow drip of water in a dark cave. Edmund closed the book with trembling hands, the leather cover creaking like a faint whisper. His breath was shallow, his chest tight, as though the room itself were closing in around him. He had uncovered too much to ignore. The secrets of the crypt were bound in this hymn, a hymn that had been hidden away for so long. And now, it was calling again. He placed the book down on the desk, his eyes lingering on the cover, on the faint imprint of a child's hand sewn into the leather. His stomach turned as he stood, the room still vibrating with the echoes of the past. The smell of milk and ink was thick in the air, heavy with the weight of promises made and broken. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a distant wail. Edmund could not shake the feeling that the book was not finished with him, that somehow it was waiting for the next verse to be sung, and when it was sung, the darkness would come. The air was thick with dust, each particle suspended in the dim, slanting light that filtered through the cracked window. Edmund sat alone in the study, the pages of an old, leather-bound diary open before him. The journal had belonged to one of the crypt's original keepers, a man long forgotten by the town, but whose fate had been sealed in silence, much like the crypt itself. His name was Father Tobias, and as Edmund read the brittle, yellowed pages, he could almost hear the echoes of the man's thoughts. Trapped in the ink for all eternity, the diary's entries were cryptic at first, little more than ramblings of faith, but as Edmund's fingers turned the pages, the tone grew darker, more fragmented. Father Tobias had been a man of piety, a man who had sworn an oath to protect the sacred grounds, to guard the crypt's secrets. But as time wore on, the silence that had enveloped the crypt began to consume him as well. The crypt keeper's words shifted, and in the late pages, there was a singular phrase that chilled Edmund to the core. Her mouth was stitched shut with thread too fine for mortal hands. The words struck him like a physical blow. What had Tobias seen? What had he encountered in that forsaken place that would make him, a man of God, resort to such a phrase? Edmund paused, his breath caught in his throat. There had been whispers of unspeakable horrors in the cryptid bodies, mutilated, bound by rituals lost to time, but nothing like this. The crypt keeper's words hinted at something far more sinister, something that had been hidden, locked away, behind the stone walls, its silence enforced by a sacred pact. Father Tobias's final entries spoke of a descent into madness. His handwriting became more erratic, the ink splotched with what appeared to be blotches of something dark blood. Perhaps, Edmund could not tell. The crypt keeper's fate had been sealed the moment he had ventured into the crypt too deep, uncovered too much. His final days had been spent in isolation, scribbling frantically in his journal as if to capture the terrible truth before it consumed him entirely. I hear it now. Tobias had written in one entry, the whispering in the walls, the voices of those who were never meant to speak, the ones who were silenced before they could speak their names, the ones whose mouths were stitched shut so that no word of their suffering could escape. Edmund's pulse quickened as he read those words. The image was horrifying, but the implication was worse. The crypt was not just a tomb, it was a prison. The people who had been locked within its walls had not been given a peaceful rest. They had been bound, their very voices stolen. And Father Tobias, in his final moments, seemed to have understood the magnitude of the silence he had been tasked with preserving. He turned the page, his fingers trembling. The final entry was written in a shaky hand, the words barely legible. "I have seen her. She is the one who guards the crypt, the one who keeps the silence. Her mouth was stitched shut, and she will never speak again. I am bound by the same thread, the same oath, but I cannot escape. I cannot escape her." A cold shiver ran down Edmund's spine. The crypt keeper's last words were filled with dread, with an understanding that silence was the only protection left, the only thing that could keep the horrors of the crypt at bay. But even Tobias's silence had not saved him. The crypt's grip had tightened around him, and now, centuries later, Edmund felt that same weight pressing down on his chest. It was as if the crypt itself was calling to him, urging him to continue the search, to uncover more secrets that should never have been disturbed. He stood, the diary still open in front of him, and looked out the window. The village was bathed in the soft light of dusk, the air thick with the scent of earth and old wood, but something was wrong. The silence that had always hung over the place felt different now. It was no longer passive, it was watching him. Edmund's eyes were drawn to the distant church, its silhouette framed by the darkening sky. The bells had not rung in years, but he could hear them now, faintly, as though they were coming from far below the earth, from deep within the crypt. The sound echoed in his chest, a rhythm that felt too familiar, too much like the hymn he had uncovered days before. He walked to the desk, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor the only noise in the room. His fingers, once trembling, now moved with purpose, touching the fragile pages of the journal once more. He felt the weight of Father Tobias's final confession pressing down on him, the unspeakable knowledge that had been buried for so long. The crypt keeper had understood to length the silence, the oath, the ritual. It was all a prison. As Edmund scanned the last few pages, something caught his eye, something he had missed before. A faint sketch, barely visible, was scrawled in the margin of one of the entries. It was a crude drawing, but the details were unmistakably an image of a woman, her face twisted in agony, her mouth sewn shut with fine, delicate thread. And beneath the drawing, there was a word. Her name was never spoken aloud. The room seemed to darken further as Edmund stared at the sketch, his heart racing. The crypt keeper's silence had been a curse. The oath that had been sworn to protect the crypt, to keep its secrets, had been a lie. The woman in the drawing, the one whose mouth had been sealed, had been one of the sacrifices, one of the bound. She had been erased, her name lost to time, her voice silenced forever. Edmund turned away from the diary, the weight of its contents pressing in on him. The crypt's secrets were not meant to be uncovered, and yet, here he was standing at the edge of the abyss, staring into the silence that had once protected the town. He could not stop now. He had to know. But as he moved toward the door, the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper, and the bells, still tolling, rang louder in his ears, as though the crypt itself was calling him back. The altar stood silent in the crypt, draped in shadow. Edmund had never thought to look, here had never dared. The smell of damp stone and earth had always made his heart heavy, as it pulled him deeper into the labyrinth beneath the church. But today, there was something different. Today, the darkness seemed to beckon him closer. Perhaps it was the weight of the journal he had found. Perhaps it was the sound of the bells tolling. Or perhaps it was simply the unbearable pull of the past, desperate to be remembered. The crypt had always been a place of secrets, of silent oaths sworn by men long gone, their voices swallowed by time. But something had remained, something more than just the bones of the dead dot. As Edmund moved toward the altar, he noticed something different. There, tucked into the stone beneath the altar's base, was a hidden compartment. Its existence had eluded him until now. He felt an inexplicable compulsion to pry it open, the faintest trembling of his fingers betraying the unease that ran through his veins. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the very crypt itself was holding its breath. The compartment opened with a soft scrape, the wood inside old and fragile, the scent of decay thick in the air. And then, he saw it. A priest's vestment, folded neatly, but the fabric had grown stiff with age. It was no ordinary garment. The vestment was tattered, its once vibrant colors now muted, but it was the stains that stopped him cold. They were not just bloodstains, no, the patterns were deliberate. They seemed to form a design, something that was far too organized to be the result of a mortal injury. They were symbols, runes, etched into the fabric, their meaning obscured by time. But Edmund could feel the weight of their significance. He lifted the vestment carefully, as though it might unravel in his hands, its very texture a reminder of the silent oaths it had witnessed. The threadbare cloth brushed against his fingers, cold and lifeless. His heart thundered in his chest as the faintest tremor of recognition tugged at his memory. He had seen these symbols before, though they eluded him now, hidden behind layers of dust and years of neglect. The crypt was not just a tomb, it was a tether, a binding force that had held these secrets long after their keepers had gone. As he unfolded the vestment, something moved within him, something dark and familiar. The fabric's edges were stained, not just with blood, but with something more ancient, more terrible. Milk, perhaps, but there was no scent of it now, only the faintest residue of something that had once been alive, an echo of life that had long since been extinguished. His mind raced, the room spinning as the realization hit him like a jolt of cold air. The vestment was not meant to be worn. It was a symbol of a covenant, a binding. The crypt keepers had sworn an oath, and the price had been written in their very garments. The crypt had claimed them, had taken them into its walls, and their bodies had disintegrated, but their souls they had never left. The crypt had kept them, tethered to the stone. The priest's vestment was their last mark upon the world, an imprint of what had been lost. Edmund's gaze fell upon the altar once more. There was something else beneath the layers of dust, something far darker than the crypt's cold stone. The altar itself seemed to hum with a forgotten energy, an old, unspoken power. The crypt had been a prison, yes, but it had also been a conduit, a place where the sacred and the profane intertwined, where the priest's oaths had tied them to the crypt's walls, to the silence that had sealed them within. A soft crackling sound came from the walls, as though the stone itself was alive, moving, shifting in the dark. Edmund's breath caught in his throat as the air thickened, oppressive, as though something was watching him, waiting. He looked back at the vestment, now spread open before him. The symbols were clearer now, though they still made no sense. But in the center, there was one that stood out, a symbol of binding, of silence, of something being held captive. His fingers trembled as he traced the lines with his fingertips, a cold, clammy sensation rising in the pit of his stomach. The crypt had been a place of ritual, of sacrifice, of binding promises. The priests had offered their bodies, their very essence, in exchange for the silence that had kept the town's secrets. But silence, Edmund realized, had never been the true bargain. The vestment had been their prison, their punishment for knowing too much. And now, the crypt's walls had held them for far too long. The vestment was the key to understanding the true cost of their silence. A faint whisper echoed through the room, so soft, so faint, that Edmund almost thought it was the wind. But there was no breeze in the crypt, no wind, only the deep, suffocating quiet that seemed to grow with every passing second. "We are the chosen, we are the bound." The words rang through his mind, clear and insistent, as though they were being spoken directly into his soul. Edmund staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest, the air thick with a sense of dread that he could not shake. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows stretching longer with each passing moment. The crypt had not just claimed the priests, it had claimed their very souls, tethering them to the stone, to the silence, to the darkness that lay beneath. And now, Edmund knew, he had become part of that story. The silence had called to him, and he had answered. He had uncovered the secrets that the crypt had held for so long, but he had not yet understood the cost. The vestment lay before him, a symbol of the past, of the priests who had been bound by their faith, by their oaths, by their silence. And as he looked at it, the weight of their fate settled heavily upon his shoulders. The crypt had kept its secrets, but the silence had never truly been theirs to keep. Edmund turned away, his heart racing, his breath shallow. The walls seemed to pulse around him, alive with the echoes of 1,000 whispered prayers. The crypt had claimed its keepers, and now it was claiming him. He could feel it, could feel the ancient silence pulling at him, tugging him into its depths. And as he stepped back, he heard the faintest sound, like the fluttering of a page, the soft rustle of fabric. It was the vestment, still moving, still calling to him. And as the shadows grew longer, Edmund realized with a sinking heart that he, too, was bound to the crypt. The wind howled through the crooked streets of Glenmore, a low, mournful cry that seemed to carry with it the weight of centuries. The village was still, as if holding its breath, waiting for something that none of its inhabitants dared to speak of. The crypt stood at the edge of town, its silhouette barely visible against the bruised sky. For years, it had been locked, its secrets buried beneath the stone. But today, the door was open. It was not the first time this had happened. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones 3 times in total. They said the door had creaked open. Each time, something terrible had followed. The first time was when a group of children had gone missing, their small bodies never found. The second time, a priest had disappeared, his absence marked by the faintest trace of blood leading to the crypt. The third time, the town had been gripped by an unnatural cold, the kind that sank deep into the bones and refused to leave. People spoke of it as a curse, a thing to be feared and avoided. But now, the door had opened again. Edmund stood at the edge of the crypt, his heart heavy with the knowledge he could no longer escape. He had been drawn to this place, just as those before him had been. The crypt was more than just a burial ground. It was a pact, a twisted covenant forged long ago, one that bound the village to something far older, far darker than anything they could comprehend. The door opening was not a sign of release, but of something far worse, something that had always been there, waiting. The stone door groaned as it swung open, its ancient hinges protesting the movement. Edmund stood motionless, watching as the darkness inside seemed to swallow the light. The air grew thick, heavier with every passing second, and a coldness seeped from the depths of the crypt, seeping into his very bones. It was a chill that went beyond temperature, something that froze the mind as much as the flesh. He could hear the faintest echo of a bell tolling in the distance, its sound distant yet unmistakably clear, the same bell that had tolled each time the door had opened before. Edmund had heard the stories, the whispers that had been passed down through generations. The villagers spoke of the door opening as a sign of something, the coming of a reckoning, a punishment for a pact made long ago. The first time, the children had vanished, and the town had been left in mourning. The second time, the priest had disappeared, as if swallowed by the very earth, his fate sealed by the crypt's unholy grip. And the third time, the cold had come, a cold that seemed to freeze not just the body but the spirit, leaving behind a silence that had never truly left the town. But the door was open now, and Edmund knew, deep in his heart, that this time would be different. This time, the reckoning would come for them all. He stepped forward, the crunch of his boots on the gravel, the only sound in the suffocating silence. The air seemed to vibrate, with an energy that felt ancient, primal. His fingers brushed the cold stone of the crypt's threshold, and he felt it a pulse, deep within the walls. As if the crypt itself was alive, he had always known, in the deepest parts of his mind, that the crypt was not merely a place of death. It was something else, something that had been hidden for far too long. The darkness inside seemed to beckon him, pulling him deeper, drawing him into its depths. He hesitated for only a moment, his mind racing, his heart thundering in his chest. He had come this far, he had uncovered too much to turn back now. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. The stone walls were covered in centuries of dust, the remnants of forgotten rituals etched into the very fabric of the place. The faintest trace of symbols, long worn away by time, seemed to glow in the dim light. They were not just markings, they were a language that spoke of ancient pacts, of promises made and broken, of sacrifices made to something that had never truly been meant to be tamed. Edmund's breath caught in his throat as he stepped further into the crypt, his eyes searching the shadows for some sign, some clue as to what had been hidden here for so long. And then he saw it. At the far end of the crypt, beneath the altar, lay something that should not have been there. A stone, not part of the original structure, a smooth, polished surface that reflected the dim light like a mirror. It was not just any stone, it was a seal that had been broken, as though something had emerged from beneath it, something that had been kept locked away for centuries. The crypt had not just been a tomb, it had been a prison. Edmund's mind reeled as the realization hit him. The village had not just been cursed by the cryptite, had been bound to it, bound by the very pact that had opened the door. The children, the priest, the cold, they were not mere coincidences. They were the price that had been paid, each one a sacrifice to keep the darkness locked away. And now, the door had opened again, that he stepped closer to the seal. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, the stone groaning as though it, too, was waking from a long, deep slumber. A faint whisper, so soft that it was almost inaudible, seemed to fill the air. "The pact is broken. The door is open. You cannot close it." Again the words echoed in his mind, the chill of them sinking deep into his bones. Edmund's heart raced as he turned, his eyes searching the shadows, the silence pressing in on him from all sides. The bell continued to toll, its sound now a dirge, a funeral march for the village and all that had been lost. He could feel it, now, the presence that had always been there, the force that had been waiting, patient and hungry. The door had opened, the reckoning had come, and as Edmund turned to face the darkness, he realized, with a sickening certainty, that he, too, had become part of the pact. The crypt's door had opened once again, but this time, the village dared not ignore it. For years, it had remained locked, the stone entrance sealed by oaths older than the town itself. But when the door creaked open, so did the veil that had kept the horrors hidden. The whispers returned, faint at first, barely perceptible. Yet, as the shadows stretched further from the crypt's threshold, the sound grew louder, filling the air with words that none could truly comprehend. Edmund had known this day would come. He had spent years uncovering the crypt's secrets, only to realize the more he learned, the less he understood. Now, standing at the entrance, the walls seemed to breathe around him, as if they were alive, remembering the sins of those who had come before. The whispers rose from the very stone itself, weaving through the cracks, the very air vibrating with their ancient song. He entered the crypt, his footsteps echoing against the cold walls. The heavy scent of dust and decay hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The light from his lantern cast long, trembling shadows across the floor, as though the darkness itself was trying to swallow him whole. Edmund moved slowly, feeling the weight of history press down on him, until his eyes landed on the walls. Carved into the stone, almost hidden beneath layers of soot and grime, were symbols that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. Directly at them, his breath caught in his throat as he examined them more closely. The symbols were too familiar, too deliberate, to be accidental. They were names that repeated in strange patterns, linked by threads of ancient markings. But the names were not of strangers. They were the children, the priests, the lost villagers, the ones who had vanished, their bodies never found. But their souls, Edmund knew now, had never left. His lantern trembled in his hand, casting eerie shadows on the walls as the symbols began to connect, forming a disturbing pattern that pulled him deeper into the crypt. The names were all bound by one thing: blood. The same blood that had stained the crypt, the blood that had soaked into the earth, saturating the stones with a promise that had been made centuries ago. A promise that had never been meant to be broken. As he ran his fingers along the symbols, the whispers in the walls grew louder, as though they were trying to tell him something hidden from the mortal world. The symbols were not just names, they were links, chains that bound the villagers to a twisted pact. Each name, each child, each priest, had they all been sacrifices? Edmund's mind raced as the horrifying realization began to settle within him. This crypt was not just a burial place, it was a prison for souls bound by an ancient covenant. The symbols led him deeper, further into the crypt, until he reached a hidden alcove. The stone walls here were smooth, untouched by time's decay, as if the secrets of this place had been sealed away long ago. Edmund knelt, feeling the weight of what he was about to uncover. He ran his fingers across the cold stone, searching for something, anything that might explain the meaning of the markings. And then, he found it. Behind a loose stone, there was a hidden compartment, its entrance concealed by centuries of dust and neglect. Edmund's heart quickened as he pried it open, the stone sliding easily beneath his touch. Inside, there were more writings, pages that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The ink was old, faded, but the words were unmistakable. As his eyes traced the lines, a cold chill ran through him. The words spoke of the Ashford orphanage, a place he had heard of in passing, but never thought to investigate. The orphanage had burned down long ago, its records lost in the fire. But these writings, these desperate notes, revealed something far darker than he could have imagined. The orphanage had been more than just a home for abandoned children. It had been the origin of the pact, a very place where the blood had been spilled to form the covenant that bound the village to the crypt. The children, the priests, The villagers, they had all been part of the same twisted cycle. Their lives and deaths linked by a pact forged in the deepest shadows of the past. As Edmund read, the whispers in the walls grew louder, their voices more insistent, more desperate. The words seemed to twist, shifting in the dim light, as though the crypt itself was alive, feeding off his terror. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the words, the ink now dark and shifting, like a shadow creeping across the page. The children were not chosen by accident. They were bound by blood. The pact was made to keep the darkness at bay, to silence the truth. The crypt had been built to contain something far older than the village itself. The voices, the whispers, they were the souls of those who had been sacrificed, trapped in the walls, their names etched into the very stones of the crypt. Edmund had thought the door had opened by chance, but now he realized the truth. The crypt had never been meant to remain closed. It was always waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone to uncover the truth, and that someone, it seemed, was Edmund. He could hear the soft scrape of nails on stone, the sound of something moving behind the walls, just out of sight. His breath caught in his throat, and he turned, his heart racing as the whispers began to rise, louder now, more frantic. The walls seemed to close in around him, the crypt itself alive with an insatiable hunger. The door, the one that had opened so many years ago, was now nothing more than a memory. The crypt had claimed its due, and with it, the souls that had been bound by blood and silence. Edmund turned to flee, but the air seemed to thicken, the very ground beneath him shifting. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, a chorus of voices that he could no longer ignore. He had uncovered the truth, but it was too late. The crypt had taken him in, just as it had taken all the others before him, and as the door closed behind him, he could hear it, that final unsettling whisper, "You are bound," as they were. Father Lawrence stood at the edge of the crypt, his hands trembling as he reached for the weathered parchment in his grip. The old journal had been his father's, a man long since gone to dust, but whose name, now appearing in the records of the crypt, had been erased from Lawrence's memory like so much old history. That is, until the name surfaced again, the list of those bound to the crypt, buried beneath its cold stones. The crypt's door had opened once more, and the town stood still, as it always did, holding its breath. 3 times it had opened, before each event marked by tragedy, the missing children, the vanishing priest, and the unnatural cold that had settled over the village like a blanket, smothering hope. Lawrence had grown up in the shadow of that door, its ominous presence, haunting every step he took. But now, something more sinister had come to light, something that made the ground beneath his feet feel as though it might shift and swallow him whole. He entered the crypt, the air growing heavy with each step he took. It had been years since he'd last walked these hallowed halls, but everything still felt the same: the smell of dust, the dampness clinging to the stone, the eerie silence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. His father's name, so carefully buried, had emerged like an accusation, a revelation that shattered everything Lawrence had once believed. His father, a man of unwavering faith, had been part of the very fabric that held this curse in place. The crypt, it seemed, had not just been a tomb for the dead. It was a prison, one that stretched across generations. Lawrence's hands shook as he opened the journal, the brittle pages creaking in protest. His father's handwriting, elegant yet stained with time, leaped off the page like a ghost, the words searing themselves into Lawrence's soul. The door opens when the bloodlines begin to break. The silence is not a curse, it is a bond. The crypt holds what was never meant to be held. When the last tie to the bloodline is severed, the darkness will rise once more. The words seem to swim before Lawrence's eyes, the meaning elusive, yet undeniably clear. The crypt had been more than a tomb. It had been a marker, a signpost, for human fragility. The door did not open at random, as the town had always believed. It opened when the bloodlines of the village began to break, when the ties to the original pact weakened. And now, with his father's name among the victims, with the final threads of that bloodline severed, a new darkness was beginning to stir. Beneath the earth, he paused at the altar, his breath coming in short gasps, the weight of the journal pressing down on him. The stone altar was still, as it had always been, but something in the room had shifted. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were waiting for him to make a choice. He could almost hear the whispers, faint and distant, rising from the cracks in the stone, the symbols on the walls, once hidden beneath centuries of soot, seemed to come alive before his eyes. Names, long forgotten, appeared and disappeared, as though the crypt itself was breathing. The names of the lost children, the priests, the villagers, all of them bound by the bloodline that had founded the village. But Lawrence now understood what had been hidden from him all these years. His father's name had been among them. The crypt had not just taken lives, it had claimed souls, tethering them to the stone, to the silence, to the darkness. The bloodline that had sworn the original pact had kept the crypt sealed, kept its horrors at bay. But now, the last link had been broken. His father, who had once protected the crypt's secrets, had been consumed by the very thing he had sworn to guard. And in his father's death, the bond had finally unraveled. A cold gust of wind swept through the crypt. Though no windows were open, and the air was still, Lawrence's mind reeled, the coldness of the room sinking deeper into his bones. The walls seemed to close in on him, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. He could almost hear them now, the voices of the children, the priests, all those who had been sacrificed, their souls trapped in the crypt's cold embrace. And then, he saw it dot at the far end of the crypt, beneath the altar. The stone door began to shift, its ancient hinges groaning in protest. Lawrence froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The door had opened against cursed promise fulfilled. The darkness behind it stretched out like a living thing, reaching for him, pulling at him. He felt the weight of his father's journal in his hands, the pages now torn and worn from years of being hidden away. His father had written of the pact, of the silence, of the crypt's unholy power. But what had been done could not be undone. The bloodline was broken. The darkness had been unleashed. As the door creaked open wider, Lawrence stepped back, the cold air now filling the crypt, thick with the scent of earth and decay. The whispers in the walls had become a roar, a cacophony of voices begging to be heard, begging to be freed. And he realized, with sickening clarity, that he was no longer merely a witness. He had become part of the story, part of the pact that had bound the village to this cursed place. His father's words echoed in his mind, the final warning that had been hidden from him for so long. The darkness will rise, and you will be its keeper. The door opened fully then, and Lawrence felt the weight of the crypt's curse settle over him like a shroud. The darkness beyond was alive, its tendrils reaching for him, pulling at him, and he knew, in that moment, that he was lost. The last tie to the bloodline had been severed, and with it, the crypt's true power had been unleashed. The church's records were stored deep within its archives, beneath layers of dust, buried among the forgotten histories of the town. But when Edmund found the hidden ledgers, he felt something stir, something ancient and untold. His fingers trembled as he opened the first of the heavy, leather-bound books. The pages crackled in protest, their edges yellowed and curling. The ink had faded, but the weight of the words was unmistakable. As if the very air around him held its breath. It was a confession, a final admission that had been left untouched for over a century. It belonged to Father William, the first priest to lay hands on the crypt, the one who had opened the door that had since devoured so much of the village's history. Edmund had heard whispers of Father William, how his name had been erased from the records, how his fate had been swallowed by the same darkness that now seemed to spread through every corner of the town. But the confession, written in trembling ink, told a story far worse than anything Edmund had imagined. The door opened not by chance. It opened because the bloodlines had begun to break. It was never meant to be opened, and yet, I could not resist. The words shuddered on the page, as if the priest had been forced to write them under the weight of some unspeakable terror. Edmund's chest tightened as he read on, his mind struggling to grasp the implications. This was not just about a curse or a tragedy. It was a revelation that shattered the fragile understanding he had clung to for so long. Father William's confession spoke of an act, an unspeakable act, that had occurred when the crypt was first uncovered. It was not just a tomb, it was a prison, a trap meant to hold something far darker than any mortal could comprehend. And the priest, the first to open the crypt's door, had been the first to fall under its influence. I saw the truth, the confession continued. I saw the souls, the ones who had been bound to the crypt. They whispered to me, called to me, and I could not turn away. I am not the first to fall, I am the first to open it. The bloodlines have begun to break, and the darkness has begun to rise. The words swam before Edmund's eyes, their weight pressing on him from all directions. His father's name had been among the victims. The names of those lost to the crypt were not random. They were bound by blood, by a pact that had been made generations ago, a pact that had never been meant to be broken. But now, with the bloodlines faltering, the crypt's power had begun to grow once more. The darkness was returning. Edmund's breath caught in his throat as the final damning lines appeared before him. The crypt's door must never be opened again. It was never meant to open. The pact is broken, and with it, the only barrier between us and them. I can feel them feel their eyes upon me. The darkness is rising, and I will be its first sacrifice. Father William had known. He had known the truth of what lay beneath the church, what the crypt had always held. The priest had become part of the curse, bound to the crypt by his own actions, by his own curiosity. And as Edmund read the final words, a cold realization settled in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just about his father's name, or the town's hidden history. It was about something far worse. The crypt itself was alive, and it had always been waiting, watching. He closed the ledger with trembling hands, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the confession settled over him like a shroud, the coldness of the words sinking into his very bones. Father William had been the first to open the door, but he had not been the last. The crypt had claimed its victims, one by one, and with each opening, it had grown stronger, more insistent. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening as Edmund's mind raced. The crypt had always been more than just a tomb. It had been a marker, a boundary between the living and the dead, a place where the past had been sealed away. But now, with the final bloodline broken, the door had opened again, and the darkness was rising once more. Edmund turned toward the door, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The weight of the confession hung heavy in the air, suffocating him, and the whispers in the walls seemed to rise, faint but unmistakable. They were not the voices of the dead, they were the voices of something far older, far darker, something that had always been there, watching, waiting. As he stepped into the hall, the faintest sound echoed from behind him, a creak, as if the very walls were shifting. Edmund turned, his heart pounding in his chest. The ledgers lay open, the final confession still fresh in his mind, and in that moment, he understood. The crypt had never truly been sealed. It was always meant to open again, and now, it had. The whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. The door had opened once more, and with it, the final secret had been revealed. The crypt's door had remained closed again, the stone sealed tightly, as if the earth itself had swallowed the remnants of its once insatiable hunger. But the door's silence was deceiving, for a whisper had begun to stir once more, this time from within the walls of the church itself. Edmund, his soul heavy from the revelations of the past months, had returned to the place he had once known. As sacred, he could not shake the feeling that the crypt story had not yet finished with him. In the quiet solitude of the church's inner sanctum, amid the cold pews, he uncovered a letter. It was small, delicate, folded with the precision only a child could manage. The letter's paper was yellowed with age, the ink faint and trembling, as if the writer had been unsure whether their words should see the light of day. It had been hidden within a forgotten hymnal, its cover stained with the passage of time, tucked away as though its discovery would unravel something too terrible to bear. Edmund unfolded the letter, his hands shaking as he read the words. They were written by a girl, no more than 12 years old. Her handwriting was childish, but the weight of the words belied the innocence they sought to preserve. The door opened when the bloodlines broke. It was not a curse, it was mercy. I heard them sing it in the walls. The bell was a warning, but no one listened. We were meant to listen, but we didn't. I did. I heard them, and I knew the truth. The crypt was never meant to hold. It was a seal to keep them out, but it cannot keep them forever. Her words were barely legible at times, but Edmund could feel the desperation in every syllable. The letter spoke of the crypt's door opening not as a punishment, but as a mercy to those trapped within, to the souls bound to the crypt by blood and belief. The girl, with the last shred of her innocence, had understood something the adults had failed to see. Her words echoed through the hollow chambers of Edmund's heart, reverberating with a terrifying clarity. The crypt was not simply a place of death, it was a barrier. And the day the door opened was the day that the crypt had begun to fail in its purpose. It had opened not to release the dead, but to free the living from the weight of the truth. And now, the world had become unhinged. The blood is gone, the ties are broken. They will come again. The crypt cannot hold them forever. As Edmund's eyes scanned the words, the echoes of the child's quiet revelation filled the room like the last notes of a song that would never end. He understood now. His bloodline had been the key to the crypt's sealing power. Each generation, the family had been bound to the crypt, their very lives tied to its unearthly pact. The crypt, and the darkness that lived beneath it, were tied to blood, to belief, to something far older than the town itself. Edmund let the letter fall from his hands, the words haunting him with an insistent, dreadful resonance. The child's knowledge was the final piece of an endless tragedy, a tragedy whose roots sank deep into the earth like the twisted branches of a cursed tree. The crypt had never been just a place to bury the dead, had been the last defense, the final safeguard against something far worse. The crypt's door had opened, yes, but it had not been the curse everyone feared. It had been mercy. The crypt's door opening was not an ending, but a beginning, and in its wake, the darkness had begun to spread. The church felt colder now, the walls pressing in with a quiet suffocation, as if the crypt's ancient power had spread beyond the stone and seeped into the very fabric of the place. The candlelight flickered in the corner of the room, casting long, trembling shadows across the pews. Edmund turned to leave, but the sound of the bell echoed in his ears. The bell, tolling once more from somewhere deep within the crypt, its sound now a dirge, the faint lullaby of forgotten souls. The letter was the last confession, left untouched, for a century, but now it was as if the church itself had begun to mourn, to remember the truth that had been buried within its walls. Edmund's heart pounded as he pressed his hand to his chest, feeling the weight of the words, the weight of the truth that had been hidden for so long. He could not escape it. He could not escape the crypt. The bloodline was gone, the last remnants of the village's origin destroyed by time and tragedy. The crypt's door had opened, and with it, a new darkness had begun to grow. As he stepped into the cold night, the air thick with the scent of ash and earth, Edmund heard the faintest echo of the lullaby. It was soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. The sound was not of children, but of something older, something ancient, something that had always been there, waiting. The lullaby lingered, a haunting reminder of the price paid, the souls lost, and the silence that had never been enough to contain the darkness. Who can truly escape? The question lingered in his mind as the night stretched on, and the echoes of the crypt's song filled the air. The answer, Edmund knew, would never be found. It was already too late.